A hospital bracelet can't be pawned. Vivienne Marsh learned that the hard way at 26, standing in a shopper's drug mart on Bloor Street at 11 at night, turning her mother's bracelet over in her palm and knowing there was nothing left to sell. She had been a third-year biochemistry student at the University of Toronto 8 months before that. Top 12% of her cohort. A professor named Dr. Adiemi had once pulled her aside after a seminar on enzyme kinetics and told her quietly that she had the kind of mind that comes along maybe twice in a decade. She had walked home from that conversation in the November sleet, feeling like the city belonged to her. Then her mother, Frances, had her first seizure in the cereal aisle of a Low Bloor's on a Thursday afternoon, and the city stopped belonging to anyone. The diagnosis was a rare autoimmune encephalitis, the kind that attacks the brain's own receptors, the kind that few neurologists in the country had seen more than a handful of times, the kind that was expensive in ways that insurance companies wrote very careful exclusion clauses to avoid. Vivienne had spent 6 weeks reading every published paper on the condition, annotating them in the margins of a notebook she still kept beside her bed. She understood the disease better than most residents who treated it. That knowledge had cost her the degree she needed to do anything about it. The job at Auberge Laurier came through a cousin's connection. It was the kind of restaurant where the sommelier had a waiting list and the menu changed with the Quebec seasons. Vivienne wore the uniform, black jacket, white blouse, dark trousers, and she learned quickly that the work was less about food and more about making wealthy people feel like the world had been arranged specifically for them. She was good at it. She had always been good at understanding what people needed before they said it out loud. She didn't think about Dr. Adeyemi anymore. She thought about Frances's next infusion cycle and whether the parking at Toronto General was still $8 an hour. The night that changed everything began on a Wednesday in late October, when the maple trees along Laurier Avenue had gone the color of old rust and the sky over Ottawa held onto its grey like a grudge. The private dining room at Auberge Laurier, called with the restaurant's characteristic understatement La Salle, had been booked for 6 weeks under the name of Prescott Capital. The reservation had come through the general manager, Thierry, who had immediately rearranged the kitchen schedule and assigned his 2 most senior servers. Then one of them threw out his back, lifting a case of Burgundy, and Vivienne found herself standing outside those oak doors 20 minutes before service, with a notepad, and the uncomfortable awareness that the man seated inside was Richard Aldous Prescott. She knew the name the way most Canadians knew it. From business headlines, from the occasional profile in Maclean's, from the particular way people said it when they meant someone who operated above the ordinary rules of consequence. Prescott had built an investment group out of a single Northern Ontario mining claim at the age of 31. He was now 64, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion, and was in Ottawa to complete what the financial press was calling the largest private infrastructure acquisition in Canadian history. The deal involved a consortium of pension funds, 2 provincial governments, and a British firm called Caldwell Briggs, whose chairman, Oliver Caldwell, was seated across the table from Prescott when Vivienne pushed open the door. She took stock of the room in the way she had trained herself to do in those first 3 seconds. Prescott at the head, Caldwell across. 2 lawyers flanking Caldwell. Prescott's chief of staff, a compact woman named Joanna, at the near end, already looking at her phone, and at Prescott's right hand, almost invisible, in the way that people who are paid to be invisible always are, a personal physician named Dr. Gareth Sims. Vivienne noticed Sims because he noticed her first. Not in the way guests usually looked at servers. He looked at her, the way people look at variables they haven't yet accounted for. She brought the amuse-bouche. She poured the water. She stood near the credenza and watched the room with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that the most important information was always peripheral. It was during the third course that she saw it. Prescott had been talking, holding court really, the way men who have never had to perform for an audience still somehow always perform. He was gesturing with his left hand, and his voice had the particular carrying quality of someone who had never needed to repeat himself. Then, mid-sentence, the gesture stopped. His hand came to rest on the tablecloth as if he had set it down deliberately. But there was nothing deliberate about it. He had simply lost the signal. His face didn't change. That was what alarmed her. Most people, when something goes wrong with their body, the face gives it up, a flicker, a tightening around the eyes. Prescott's face stayed exactly as it was, locked in the expression of a man making a point, while his left hand lay motionless on the linen, and his right hand reached very slowly for his water glass, and didn't quite make it. Vivian had seen this before, not in a restaurant. In a hospital waiting room, watching a man 3 seats down from her experience what a passing nurse had identified very calmly as a transient ischemic attack, a TI, a warning stroke. The body briefly losing blood supply to part of the brain and then usually restoring it. The stroke that is not quite a stroke yet. She set down the dish she was carrying. She walked to the credenza. She picked up a clean glass with her right hand and brought it to Prescott's place setting, leaning slightly across him to do it, and in the process she said very quietly, close to his ear, "Mr. Prescott, can you tell me if you take your medication this morning?" He turned to look at her then. His eyes were clear, but something in them was slow, like a man reading words in a language he mostly knew. "My what?" he said. Not a question. The word just came out wrong. "Your blood thinner," she said, still quiet, still serving. She straightened up and moved back to the credenza as if she'd said nothing at all. "If you haven't, I need you to tell Dr. Sims right now." Prescott's head turned toward Sims. It turned the way a ship turns, with authority and at too slow a speed. Sims was already watching her. His expression was not concern. It was something colder, more calculating. "Is there a problem?" Oliver Caldwell said from across the table, because the rhythm of the room had shifted in the way that rooms shift when something is happening that no one wants to name. "Not at all," Vivian said. She looked at Sims directly. "Doctor, your patient's left hand has been immobile for approximately 90 seconds. He's exhibiting mild expressive dysphasia. I think you should assess him now." Sims stood up. He moved to Prescott's side with the practiced ease of someone performing competence rather than exercising it. He checked Prescott's grip. He asked him to repeat a phrase. He looked at Vivienne with an expression that was supposed to convey reassurance and instead conveyed irritation. "Mr. Prescott experiences occasional tension headaches. This is nothing unusual. I appreciate your concern, but I think we can allow our dinner to proceed. Attire presents with transient unilateral weakness and speech disruption," Vivian said, and her voice did not rise. "It resolves, yes, but it is a pre-stroke event, without verification that his anticoagulant levels are therapeutic. The risk of a completed ischemic stroke in the next 48 hours is significantly elevated. He needs a CT angiogram, not next week. Tonight." The room was completely quiet. Oliver Caldwell set down his fork. Joanna looked up from her phone. Sims turned to face her fully, and his voice dropped to something that was meant to be discreet, but was really designed to diminish. "I'm a licensed physician. You are a waitress. I think it's best if you return to your duties." Vivienne looked at him. She thought of her mother in a hospital bed, of 6 neurologists who had each run a different protocol, and none of them had cross-referenced the others. She thought of the morning she'd sat in a library carrel at U of T and read a case study about a woman in Calgary whose TI had been attributed to fatigue by her attending physician who had sent her home and who had had a massive stroke before midnight. She looked at Prescott. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "I need you to raise your left hand." He tried. His right hand came up instead. That was when Joanna stood up. The next 20 minutes were organized chaos. Joanna called 911. Vivian stayed at Prescott's side, monitoring his speech, keeping him calm, speaking to him in the slow and level cadence she had learned in the third-year neurology module she had completed before everything stopped. Sims hovered at the periphery of the room, making phone calls she suspected were not to medical colleagues. The paramedics arrived and confirmed what Vivian had suspected. Prescott was loaded into an ambulance on Bank Street while Ottawa's cold air came through the restaurant's front doors and made the candles gutter. Caldwell and his lawyers left. The deal, which had been 12 hours from signing, was in suspension. Vivian cleaned the table. She was in the staff changing room at midnight, her jacket off, when Thierry came in. He did not look at her face. He looked at the wall, just past her left shoulder, in the way that men look at things when they have already decided what they're going to say, and don't want to be interrupted by your expression. "There's going to be a settlement offer," Thierry said. "There's going to be a settlement offer. So, for the disruption you caused to the dinner, to the business proceedings, wie viel?" He would have driven back to his hotel and had a stroke in his sleep. "The offer is $40,000, Thierry's, and a non-disclosure agreement," Thierry said. "A non-disclosure?" She looked at him. "What does the NDA cover?" "Everything. The dinner, his medical condition, his physician, your intervention." Thierry finally looked at her directly, and she saw something in his face that was almost sorry. "You also need to know that you would no longer be needed here. The policy on guest contact." "I know. The policy, Vivienne. $40,000. She thought about her mother's infusion schedule. She thought about the amount the specialist at St. Michael's had quoted her 6 weeks ago for a new treatment protocol, the one that had better outcomes, the one that the standard OHIP coverage didn't reach. $180,000. $40,000 got her to the corner, but not across the street. She thought about something else, too. When the paramedics had arrived, while Vivian had been kneeling beside Prescott, and Richard Prescott, a man who in 30 years of public life had been photographed, looking uncertain approximately 0 times, had looked at her with something unguarded in his eyes, and said, very quietly, "You knew?" "Yes," she said. "How?" "I've spent a lot of time in hospitals," she said. He had closed his eyes then, but before he did, he said, "Whatever you need, whatever it costs." Vivian picked up her jacket from the bench. "Keep the 40,000, she told Thierry. "I'll be in touch." She walked out into the Ottawa night and took the 95 bus back to the apartment she shared with her mother near Carlington, and she sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning reading the publicly available financial disclosures on Prescott Capital and thinking about what she was going to say. 3 days later, she walked into the lobby of the Prescott Capital offices on Elgin Street, wearing the same denim jacket she wore on her days off, carrying a manila folder and the particular posture of someone who has stopped waiting to be given permission. The receptionist asked if she had an appointment. Vivian said that she was the woman who had been with Mr. Prescott on Wednesday night, and that she believed he would want to speak with her. She was prepared to wait. She waited 40 minutes. Then Joanna came out and took her back. Prescott's office was on the 11th floor with a view of the Rideau Canal going silver-grey in the November light. He was seated behind a glass desk, thinner-looking, than he had been in the restaurant, a slight asymmetry around his mouth that had not been there before, and that she suspected was residual. He was reading something. He didn't put it down when she walked in. Dr. Sims was standing by the window. A lawyer, whom she hadn't met, was seated in a chair near the door. "Miss Marsh," Prescott said, "declined our settlement offer." "I did," Vivienne said. "The NDA was quite generous. I'm sure it was." Now he put down what he was reading and looked at her. There was more color in his face than she'd expected, given the week he'd had. Whatever the tie had taken from him, it hadn't touched whatever it was that had made him who he was. "My legal team tells me I have no enforceable obligation to you," he said. "The verbal assurance I gave was made during a medical incident. Under duress, not a contract." "I know," Vivienne said. "Then what are you doing here?" She opened the manila folder and placed it on the glass desk in front of him. It was not a legal document. It was a printed summary, 12 pages, dense with citations of every published study on his likely diagnosis, including the most recent literature on a specific subtype of TI associated with a combination of medications that, when cross-referenced, appeared twice in Sims's prescription records for Prescott over the past 18 months. She had pulled those records from the publicly accessible dataset of the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, cross-referenced against Prescott's own disclosed travel and hospitalization history in his company filings, and built what amounted to a clinical timeline. Prescott picked up the first page. He read in silence for 30 seconds. "Go on," he said. "Dr. Sims has been prescribing you a calcium channel blocker for your blood pressure since early last year," Vivienne said, standing with her hands still. "He added a platelet aggregation inhibitor in the spring. Independently, both drugs are standard. Together, in patients with a specific CYP2C19 enzyme variant, which is more common in people with Northern European ancestry, they create a paradoxical coagulation response. Your blood doesn't thin appropriately. It doesn't clot appropriately either. It oscillates, and in moments of high stress or elevated cortisol, a high-stakes dinner, a major business negotiation, the cerebrovascular system becomes acutely vulnerable," she continued. It was very quiet. She continued, "The literature on this particular interaction has been available since 2019. It isn't obscure. Any physician managing long-term cardiovascular care for a patient your age, with your history, should have flagged it. The fact that Dr. Sims hasn't, and that your episodes have been increasing in frequency over exactly the period he's been managing your care, is something I think you should ask him to explain." Sims made a sound from by the window. It was the sound of a man calculating. "Mr. Prescott, this woman has no medical credentials. She dropped out of—" "I know what she dropped out of," Prescott said. He hadn't taken his eyes off the page. "Joanna told me." He turned to the third page. He read. He turned to the fourth. The clock on the wall marked a minute and then part of another one. Then he looked up at Sims. It was not a long look. It didn't need to be. "Joanna," he said. She appeared in the doorway instantly. "Please ask building security to escort Dr. Sims out. Have IT revoke his building access. Contact the College of Physicians and Surgeons this afternoon and request a formal review of his management of my case for the past 24 months. He paused. "And call Toronto General. I want an appointment with whatever's a specialist they consider the best in the country for this particular condition. Today, if possible." Sims opened his mouth. "Leave your bag," Prescott said. "Everything in it belongs to my file." Sims left. The lawyer by the door looked like he was reconsidering his career choices. Prescott turned back to Vivienne. He closed the folder. He set it neatly on his desk in the way of a man who intends to read every page of it tonight, alone, in the careful silence of someone learning the terms of his own survival. "What does your mother need?" he said. Vivian felt the question land in a way she hadn't prepared for. She had prepared for negotiation. She had not prepared for directness. "A treatment protocol at St. Michael's," she said. "Autoimmune encephalitis. There's a new targeted immunotherapy that isn't covered under provincial insurance. The program costs. Send the details to Joanna," Prescott said. "Full cost. My foundation will fund it, and I'd like to finish my degree." He looked at her steadily. "Biochemistry? Yes. At Toronto? Yes. I'll speak to the Dean of Science on Monday," he said. "As a donor, I have that conversation from time to time. I'll explain that the university allowed one of its best students to leave without adequate support, and that I consider that a correctable oversight." He folded his hands on the desk. "I'll also be speaking to my board on Friday. I need a director of health strategy for the Prescott Foundation. It's a new role. It didn't exist before Wednesday night." He paused. "It pays well. You'd be working with researchers, with clinicians, with policy people. You'd finish your degree first. The role would wait." Vivienne looked at him. She thought of a lot of things in a short span of time. She thought of the notebook beside her bed with the annotated papers on her mother's disease. She thought of Dr. Adeyemi and what he'd said about the kind of mind that comes along twice in a decade. She thought of the hospital bracelet she'd stood holding in a shopper's drug mart at 11 at night. "I'll need an office," she said. Something shifted in Prescott's face. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough people to recognize precisely the quality of what is in front of him. "You'll have one," he said. The press conference was 2 weeks later, held in the atrium of Toronto General Hospital, which had agreed to host it as part of a major philanthropic announcement from the Prescott Foundation. Richard Prescott stood at the podium looking considerably healthier than the financial press had expected, given the rumors that had circulated since the Ottawa dinner. The new medication protocol, adjusted under the guidance of 3 independent specialists, with the flawed interaction formally flagged and significant college, had made a rapid and significant difference. He spoke for 11 minutes about the Foundation's new health initiative, about the funding commitment to autoimmune research, about a partnership with U of T's Faculty of Medicine. He mentioned, near the end, that this work had been catalyzed by an encounter with a remarkable person who had understood something that a room full of credentialed professionals had missed. He didn't say her not to. She had asked him. She was standing at the back of the room in her denim jacket, next to her mother, Frances, who was seated in a wheelchair, but who had, for the first time in 14 months, recognized the room she was in when she woke up that morning and asked for coffee with exactly the right amount of milk. The deal with Caldwell Briggs closed the following Monday. Caldwell had called Prescott personally after reading the Foundation's announcement. He said, in the particular way of British businessmen acknowledging that they have reconsidered something, that he had always admired clarity of purpose. Vivian enrolled at U of T in January. She sat in the back of Dr. Adeyemi's seminar room on her first day back, a Tuesday in the grey heart of a Toronto winter, and he spotted her from the front of the room during his opening remarks and paused, very briefly, in a way that no one else would have noticed. After class, he fell into step beside her in the hallway without preamble. "I heard," he said. "It was just a dinner," she said. He looked at her sideways. It was never just a dinner. She walked out into the January cold with her notebook under her arm, the canal grey sky pressing low over the city, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself think about what came next.